Hey guys, Mickey here with MVP Designs. I appreciate you coming by and checking out my white oak TV cabinet build. This was a project that had been on my mind for a while. I had kind of been putting it off because it required some other renovations in our den room. We wanted to create an accent wall with some shiplap in which we would be putting a Samsung picture TV on that wall. And I really wanted to create a piece that would be kind of the focal point along with that wall. And I had the idea of coming up with, a cabinet with white oak that would house some books, some toys, a lot of our TV equipment. And I wanted it to be a very focal point of the room. So first we had to demo some walls, and put up the shiplap, run some electric so that the TV could be hung. So that was kind of the first process, and then was the build. Now, this was my first true piece of like cabinetry in the sense of like furniture. I've built the cabinets behind me. I've done some other cabinets and such in our mudrooms and things like that, but I've never been able to build a furniture type cabinet. So this was the first time, and the inspiration is I wanted something that was whitewashed. So white oak was the material that I decided to use here. For the design, it's something that, I had used some of the plans that I received through Four Eyes Furniture and through their design. I think it was their Savoto dresser, which was basically a cabinet and 3 drawers. I wanted both cabinets. So I essentially took their design and their plans because I wanted to get a better idea of what joinery to use, considering it would not be none of this cabinet was made out of plywood. It was all solid wood, 5/4 and 4/4 white oak. And it was really just panels that I glued up. The front piece was one continuous grain pattern that I wanted to be across the front. And needless to say, I was thrilled with the way this project turned out. I think it really sets a great scene for the room. Again, it was something that was a lot of fun for me to build. Learned a lot of new things, and the plans that I got through Four Eyes was really helpful in terms of the milling process, the joinery, and all the things that involved that I was a little bit unsure of. So I hope you enjoyed the build. Thanks for tuning in, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and thanks for your time and tuning in. I started off by cutting down my boards to rough dimensions. Personally, I like doing this on my miter saw. However, you can do this using a circular saw or a jigsaw. During this time is when you really start to figure out where your boards are going to go. Through this process, you are working through any imperfections in the wood and finding out which is going to yield the best surfaces while also minimizing waste. For this particular build, I'm finding the best boards to use on the top and the sides of the cabinet so that I have the best boards situated where they will be most visible. For this project, I'm using 5/4 lumber for the top, bottom, sides, and middle panel of the cabinet, and 4/4 for the door fronts. Once I have everything cut to rough dimensions, I start to lay out where I will be putting the biscuits for joining the boards. It's important to note that for the top and bottom boards, I'm not putting a biscuit dead center because I will be using a stop dado for the middle panel, and I don't want there to be any interference. After I finish marking out where all my biscuits will go, I use some painter's tape and I start marking out each piece and where they will go. Anytime you have a big project like this with multiple pieces, organizing and labeling the pieces will save a lot of time and avoid any costly mistakes. Now that all my pieces were labeled, I began cutting slots for biscuits. Biscuits are not used for joint stability or strength. Their only role is to properly align the boards during the glue up and to ensure solid joinery. Once all the slots for biscuits were cut, it was time for glue up. Here I used Titebond 3 and some cabinet clamps to glue up all my panels. At each seam, I used some clamps to bring together the ends in order to mitigate any gapping at the ends of the boards. As I'm going through the gluing process, I like to try to clean up as much of the glue as possible with a damp rag. This way, when I go to sanding later, there's less material that I have to remove and clean up. After all the boards were glued up and out of clamps, I used my orbital sander and some 80 grit sandpaper, and I rough sanded all the surfaces before moving forward in the building process. From there, I went ahead and cut all my panels to their proper length using my track saw. Note, I'm cutting the top and bottom about 1/4 inch longer than in my final dimensions. I'll tell you why I did this later in the video. I'm using rabbet joints to join together the panels of the cabinet carcass. To do this, I'm going to use my plunge router and a 1/2 inch downcut spiral bit. First I set my depth to 3/8 inch, then I set my line based on the thickness of my boards, plus about 1/8 inch, and set my bit on the inside of that line. Referencing the base of my router, I draw a line where I will be setting the straight edge to run along when I make my cut. When making these cuts, use some of your scrap wood of the same thickness to run along the boards to ensure that the router stays level. You can also clamp your scrap at the end of each pass to reduce any tear out from the router. For these cuts, I placed both the top and bottom boards side by side and did it in one pass. This way the cuts are identical and it's consistent top and bottom. Once my rabbets were cut, I used my table saw and I notched out a 1/2 inch deep groove in the back of each panel to house my 1/4 inch back panel. Now if you recall, I cut my top and bottom panels 1/4 inch longer than the final dimensions of the cabinet, and here's why. I wanted the top and bottom panels to sit about 1/8 inch proud of the side panels, so that once the cabinet is fully glued up, I can come back with my flush trim bit and flush up the edges. This way I have a seamless joint across each corner. Now it was time to cut my stop dado on the inside part of the cabinet. This is to hold my middle panel.
I did this using a 1/4 inch down spiral bit and my palm router. Similar to my rabbets, I drew out where my dados were going to be and referenced my bit up to the edge, then set a straight edge to ride along for this pass. Note that I take 2 1/8 inch passes, removing small amounts of material each pass until I reach my desired depth of 1/4 of an inch, and I make sure I stop about 3 inches short of the front of the cabinet. From there, using a pole saw, I remove the material from the middle panel that will sit towards the front of the cabinet, and using a plane and some chisels I clean up any material before sliding it into the cabinet. Now that the cabinet carcass is fully assembled, I can start on the base. I glue up 3 pieces of the 5/4 material for my feet and start cutting them down to size. Using my tapering jig, I start by creating 1 flat reference side on the top of each piece. I had to do this in 2 passes because these particular pieces were bigger than the height of my saw blade. Once things had been rough cut down, I then began to set it up and cut each individual leg. Once all 4 legs were cut to size, I started marking them for the taper I was looking for. Because these were so thick and they exceeded the height of my table saw blade, I could not use my taper jig to cut these down, so I fashioned out a jig on my miter saw using a sacrificial fence and some blocks for reference. I realized for safety purposes I should have had a hold down clamp holding down the legs, but unfortunately I didn't have one, so I did the best I could here. Nonetheless, the double taper came out really nice on these legs. Once all the legs were cut and tapered, I went on to cutting all the dominoes to join the base together. One note here is you could easily use a dowel jig to do this joinery. I was able to borrow a domino joiner from a friend, and it certainly made this process a whole lot easier and faster. But again, you can use a simple dowel jig for joinery here. Then it was on to glue up after a quick dry fit. I actually remembered to get some footage of this glue up, as it was far less stressful than the cabinet glue up. So here's some B-roll. Once the cabinet base was out of clamps, I went ahead and marked out all my spaces for my mounting hardware. For this project, I just used some simple desktop fasteners from Rockler. Next was to drill out the inserts for hinges on the cabinet doors. Anytime I use hinges, I use the Craig jig for this process. It's so simple to use, and it speeds things up when drilling out the holes for multiple doors. Plus, I don't have a drill press, so this is the best option for repeat cuts. For the hinges, I use Blum soft close inset hinges.
For this particular build, I don't have any footage of me doing the mounting hardware like the cabinet drawer or the cabinet doors and the cabinet hinges or the pulls, simply because we were kind of in a rush, and literally the day I was wrapping up and I had everything wrapped up and ready to bring inside, we got dumped with a big gigantic snowstorm, and we had like 36 inches of snow, and I didn't want to have to pull this thing from my barn, which is about 80 yards away from the house, and risk dropping it or ruining it in the transportation process. So I brought it into the house and decided to finish it with Rubio monocoat, their DC smoke stain. One also thing to add is that in my barn it can get pretty cold, and I didn't want to finish it and risk any issues with getting below freezing, as it can get. I have a wood burning stove in my barn, but I don't have the ability to maintain shop temperatures like some other makers do. So I brought it in, did all the mounting, did all the drawer pulls, and then I also did all the finishing in the house, because we were actually snowed in for a couple of days, so timing worked out pretty well. So that's why I don't have any footage, so you'll just have to imagine me doing that stuff. I use Kreg jigs to cut all the holes for the concealed hinges. All these doors are inset, so I have a couple templates that I use for that, but I essentially use the Kreg jig to kind of set that up. And I made some jigs for the drawer pulls that I did out of just simple plywood. If you have any questions or things that I didn't go into, feel free to ask. I will link all the tools and resources that I use below.
Here you can see the finished product along with the shiplap accent wall and frame TV that we put up. We were thrilled with the way this turned out and how this piece of furniture brought the whole room together. If you like furniture builds like this one, check out this walnut kitchen table I built for a customer. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, share, comment, and subscribe. This is Mickey from MVP Designs. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and take care.